Like any normal day, while sitting on the toilet after taking a shit, I suddenly found myself reflecting on the possibility of the relationship between player interaction and the level of horror in games that are supposedly considered terrifying nowadays. Nah, not really, I was just playing Clash Royale like I always do in situations like this. But what is true is that I started thinking about the evolution of horror and how the elements within this genre that actually managed to scare us have changed over the years. If you think about it, horror has taken quite a turn recently, and we are seeing more and more games with increasingly experimental premises and forms of horror that are much farther removed from what we might consider traditional horror. 20 years ago, the things that scare us in games were much more conventional. Nemesis chasing us in Resident Evil, a head peeking around the corner, although I still think that works pretty fucking well, or something as repetitive as jumpscare accompanied by a sound so loud that your ears are still ringing 20 minutes after you take your headphones off. But in recent years, games like No, I'm Not a Human, Mouthwashing, or even The Exit 8 are some of the titles that have expanded the conceptual variety of horror by introducing more abstract elements like the uncanny valley, the unsettling reaction we experience when we see something that looks very human but not quite, or even things as seemingly basic and simple as endless liminal spaces, which have become increasingly well known thanks to the growing popularity of the backrooms. And I've realized that this evolution in horror is closely related to the fact that we've become increasingly desensitized to the conventional horror we grew up with. We've gotten so used to these types of scares that they simply don't affect us as much anymore because of how predictable many of them have become. So, as I mentioned before, the community has gradually embraced a more experimental style that tries to explore horror from a much more psychological perspective, putting a greater emphasis on paranoia. In other words, instead of simply showing us something scary, these games try to get inside our heads by making us uncomfortable through an ambiguous, barely visible, or completely unrecognizable threat that forces us to stay cautious at all times. And that's why in this video, I want to show you some of the games I consider to be the most disturbing on the entire internet in the following way. First, I will explain what each game is about, and then I'll try to explain from my point of view what exactly makes it so disturbing, starting with Shipwrecked 64.
Hey, everyone! I need your help!
Despite having graphics that look like they came straight out of a game from 30 years ago, what you're watching right now actually came out in 2024, and it was deliberately designed to look like a piece of Nintendo 64 lost media. In fact, the entire premise of this game revolves around making us believe that we're playing a lost video game that mysteriously disappeared shortly after its release. But underneath this seemingly innocent platformer lies a much darker story. The game follows Bucky Beaver alongside three other cartoon characters, Olive, Giovanni, and Walter. They were all created by Broadside Animation, the company behind Shipwrecked 64. But these characters were not entirely fictional. Each of them was associated with a real Broadside employee: Brandon Lester, Olivia Finch, Gary Wilson, and Nathan Stewart. And eventually all four of them ended up dead. Brandon was the first. After he died from an overdose, Broadside used his body in an experiment involving a strange organic substance capable of interacting with dead tissue and somehow bringing it back to life. The experiment worked, just not in the way you would expect. Brandon became what Broadside called a starling, a grotesque, living version of Bucky Beaver, and things only got worse from there. This new version of Bucky could eventually cause the deaths of the other three employees, and instead of putting an end to the experiments, Broadside used their bodies to create three more starlings. Olivia became Olive, Gary became Giovanni, and Nathan became Walter. So the creatures we encountered throughout the game aren't just corrupted or disturbing versions of children's characters. They are the reanimated remains of the people those characters were based on. And the only reason we can uncover any of this is because one of the game's developers, Connor Thomas, discovered what Broadside was doing. Unable to expose the company directly, he secretly buried evidence of its experiments inside of Shipwrecked 64 itself. So as we dig deeper into the game, what initially seems like a forgotten Nintendo 64 platformer slowly reveals its true purpose. It's a digital archive exposing the horrifying secrets of the very company that commissioned its creation. This kind of horror reminds me a lot of Poppy Playtime because of the way it uses body horror by transforming dead humans into grotesque creatures associated with mascots or characters, a concept that I still think is surprisingly unexplored in horror and has a lot of potential. But the thing that makes this game so unsettling is not, as you can probably guess, its graphical fidelity or some tense atmosphere that constantly makes you look over your shoulder in case an enemy is coming. It is the constant feeling that something is wrong, and that feeling becomes more and more persistent as you progress because of the increasing number of small anomalies and glitches. sounds. It gradually makes you more and more uncomfortable until places or songs that you previously perceived as normal or even childlike suddenly become terrifying. And this commonly used horror technique of associating childhood with something frightening is nothing new. I'm sure you've seen the typical children's lullaby in a horror movie or game that somehow always manages to give you goosebumps. Even something as simple as a doll or a children's toy in the right context can make us shit ourselves far more effectively than any demon ever could. And that is precisely what fascinates me about this genre. Horror has to be subtle to really work. In this case, childlike horror is especially effective because of the cognitive dissonance created when the natural association between childhood and safety is broken. Something pure and innocent gets transformed into a symbol of danger or death. I'm scared. Now we move on to a game that, despite somehow managing to look even cheaper than the previous one both graphically and mechanically, it's thematically very different. And I think its entire concept can be summarized with a single sentence. You don't play the game plays you. Because I'm Scared's sound description warns you about something from the very beginning. The game is going to try to deceive you as many times as it can, and it doesn't take long to prove it. Whiteface, the antagonist of this game, does not seem to be just another monster. It is presented almost like an entity made out of data, aware that it exists inside a video game and capable of manipulating that game in order to keep us playing. And the reason behind all of this seems surprisingly simple. Whiteface doesn't want to be alone. It deceives us, creates fake endings, and constantly changes the rules because as long as we keep playing, it has company. The game deliberately blurs the line between Whiteface, other entities like her, our characters, and even ourselves until it becomes difficult to tell exactly who is controlling whom. And near the end, we discover that Whiteface has a heart, except that this heart is not hidden somewhere inside the game. It's a file on our actual computer. To destroy it, we literally have to leave IMSCARED, find the file, and delete it ourselves. Afterwards, the game's environments become empty, silent, and illuminated by daylight, and Whiteface is ultimately reduced to the exact same thing it had been trying to escape from: loneliness. Much like other psychological horror titles such as Doki Doki Literature Club, this game deeply explores the concept of an ARG, or alternate reality game, a type of narrative experience that blends fiction with the elements of the real world, frequently breaking the fourth wall and forcing the player to use resources outside the game itself in order to progress through the story. And IMSCARED uses this technique brilliantly because it introduces a single character whose goal is not simply to chase you down and kill you, but to become so intensely obsessed with you that it wants to stay with you even outside the game. The game will suddenly close multiple times in what initially looks like a crash, but it actually is not. These apparent crashes are part of the story and are actually necessary to progress, because they allow the game sound files to change and mysterious new files to be created. And that makes Whiteface represent a very specific fear, losing control over your interaction with the game itself. Another thing I would like to highlight is the way Whiteface's personality develops throughout the game. At first, it's friendly and even a little playful with us, but as we progress and reach the different fake endings, it becomes increasingly serious and less pleasant, eventually reaching the point where it literally begs us to let it continue existing in its own world. Yume Nikki. Now that we've reached the third game, I've noticed something pretty interesting. Every game we've talked about so far deliberately uses all pixelated or unclear graphics, and I suppose part of the reason they work so well is that the less clearly we can see something, the more our imagination has to work to fill in what's missing. Although there's also the fact that these are indie games mostly developed by a single person who obviously didn't have infinite artistic resources. Anyway, let's get to the point. You play as Madotsuki, a girl who lives alone in a small room and refuses to leave her apartment. Pretty much the only things you can do while she's awake are walk around the room, step out onto the balcony, play a video game, and most importantly, sleep. Inside her dreams, Madotsuki can access dozens of worlds that seem to follow absolutely no logic. Endless forests, empty deserts, deformed creatures, and places that seem to have some deeper meaning without ever explaining what that meaning actually is. There isn't really a traditional story. We simply explore these worlds collecting 24 objects called effects, while witnessing increasingly disturbing imagery, and once you collect all of them, you can access the ending. And you're probably wondering, where exactly is the scary part in this game? Well, Yume Nikki is not a conventional horror game. There are no jumpscares, no monsters chasing you, and you don't even know whether you're actually in danger at any point. And that is exactly what makes this game so unique. Everything is unknown. Quite often, when we fully understand the things that terrify us, they automatically become less frightening precisely because we know what they are. Fear of the unknown and the unknowable is basically the only horror element this game relies on. The horror is inside your own head, as you desperately try to understand what you are looking at, while this incredibly unsettling music and these disturbing sound effects play in the background. Who's Lila? Who's Lila follows William Clark, a teenager who struggles to express emotions, and the game's main mechanic revolves precisely around that idea. Instead of choosing dialogue responses during conversations, you directly manipulate the muscles in his face to decide what emotion he should display. The story begins after the disappearance of Tanya Kennedy, a girl who was close to William. The problem is that William was one of the last people seen with her, so his classmates and eventually the police began to suspect him. As you interact with other characters, you gradually reconstruct what happened before Tanya disappeared. You discover that William knew her and that at the same time he was connected to a mysterious figure called Lila. Things get worse when we discover that Tanya was murdered and dismembered and that William is directly connected to her death. But at that point, the real mystery stops being what happened to Tanya and becomes who or what is Lila. Because Lila doesn't seem to simply be another person. She's an entity capable of taking over William's identity and body to the point where it becomes increasingly difficult to tell when we are looking at William and when we are looking at Lila. From that point onward, the game becomes increasingly surreal and starts suggesting that Lila might not even be a physical creature at all, but something closer to an idea or entity that can exist through the people who know about her and think about her. And that's why the title Who's Lila is literally the question the entire game revolves around. You start by investigating a disappearance and end up trying to understand what the hell this thing is that seems to be living through William. And there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the horror in this game. Aside from the obvious psychological horror that runs throughout the entire experience through ambiguity and the constant doubt surrounding William and his memories, the game also uses the uncanny valley brilliantly. You can manually manipulate William's face to create different emotions, which often produces expressions that look human, but not quite, and that makes them incredibly unsettling. But above all, the existential horror and the duality between Lila and William go far beyond a simple physical monster. The game asks something much more disturbing. What happens if an entity can exist as an idea and spread simply because we think about it? And I think these 4 games perfectly represent just how much horror in video games has changed, because none of them need to rely exclusively on putting a monster behind a door and waiting for you to open it. Shipwrecked 64 makes you afraid of discovering the truth behind what you're seeing. IMSCARED makes you stop trusting the boundaries of the video game itself. Yume Nikki shows you disturbing imagery and forces your own mind to try to explain what it means. And Who's Lila, after hours of playing, makes you constantly question the true nature of the character standing in front of you, while also making you shit yourself because of the twisted facial expression this game is known for. And I think that is exactly where the difference lies. After so many years of playing horror games, we already know when a room is a little too empty, when a hallway is a little too quiet, or that if the game suddenly gives you 20 bullets and a medkit right before opening a door, there's probably something very large on the other side that really wants to kill us. We have learned the rules, so some games have started changing them. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you supported it with a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you didn't enjoy it, just remember this quote from Albert Camus: "Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is."